Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this week's Squawk Talk on Socialist Telly. And this week, I am delighted to be joined by Diana Neslen, who is a Jewish Labour member and Jewish grandmother, as she was telling me before the programme, who is suing the party for its discrimination against her particular political and, I guess, combined with that, some might say religious beliefs, and by Jonathan Rosenhead, who is another Jewish Voice for Labour member. And the reason that we have our guests on the programme this week is that last weekend there was supposed to be a programme on BBC Radio 4 about the between and particularly with regard to what she and her lawyers regard as the protected beliefs that she has with regard to Israel and Palestine. And that program was yanked from the air in a rather cowardly fashion by the management at the BBC, who then put out a statement implying that it had never been going to take place in the first place, but that appears to have been the case. And, you know, there was a lot of backroom pressure put on people at the BBC to remove and not to have this debate. And there was some interesting comments going on around that as well in terms of freedom of speech, etc. So welcome onto the programme. Thank you very much for giving us your time this evening. If you're watching this live, then you can participate in the programme through the comments either on Facebook or on the YouTube stream. Sadly, Twitter still hasn't got its act together to feed the Twitter comments in to StreamYard, to the program that we use, but we will be able to take comments from people through the program if you do it in the right on the right platforms. So let's jump in. I mean, Diana, give us a little bit about, you know, how you've got to where you are and then what the current situation is now, because I think we've only got you for the first half of the program, more or less. So let's make the most of you while we have you here.
Well, I was a Labour Party member for many years, but then I left actually, and then I rejoined in 2015 when Jeremy Corbyn became leader, and I became active in Jewish Voice for Labour. But I had for many years been active with issues to do with first Jews against apartheid, because I was born in South Africa and I was an active anti-apartheid person. And then also I was in Jews for Justice for Palestinians for many years. I was active there. And I was once a Zionist. I am no longer a Zionist because I saw what Zionism meant in the context of Israel and Palestine. So I was probably too active, or maybe on social media. And when the big push against what they called anti-Semites came along, I was first given a reminder of conduct about some of my social media postings, all of which had to do with Israel or Zionism, and many of which were comments from people who were in fact Jews or Israelis who wrote in the press. And then later on, and I had a very difficult year at that time, personally difficult. And then later on in 2020, I got a notice of investigation again for anti-Semitism. And then they found me, and then I was one of the Labour activists for justice, as well as Jonathan. We both took the Labour Party to court to challenge their disciplinary processes. We were not that successful, but I think we opened up a space to at least talk about it. And this in 2021, I was found guilty of anti-Semitism and given a warning. And then after that, they sent me another notice of investigation, and that led to us writing to the party, and that led to an article in the Guardian, which talked about the protective belief of anti-Zionism. And that's what I think is an important issue to talk about tonight. What is anti-Zionism? Why is it being silenced? And who is doing the silencing? And who are the people who actively believe in anti-Zionism? And has anti-Zionism ever had a place in Jewish life, in Jewish history, and in Jewish culture? All these things are what people don't know, because there's been a very strong pressure from, I would say, the Jewish Board of Guardians not to discuss this, to keep this under wraps, because if it becomes public, then it will become that much harder for them to defend Zionism. So I believe that the Labour Party, precisely because they were using anti-Semitism when they meant anti-Zionism, because they know very little about what anti-Semitism is. In fact, they know, I would say, nothing. I mean, when these people who I regard, who aren't Jewish, have the gall to tell me that I'm an anti-Semite who suffered anti-Semitism in my own family, I think they have a cheek. And that's my position. I mean, I can enlarge on it if you want later on. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, well, let's tick the bases first, because there might be people watching who are not really, are in the same position as the Labour Party, really, and don't understand, don't understand Zionism, and don't understand how that is different from, the opposition to Zionism is different to anti-Semitism, etc. So, I mean, what is Zionism, Jonathan? Do you want to give us a very potted kind of appraisal of what that is, just so if people are not familiar with it, then they're aware what it's about?
Shall I do that, Diana?
Yeah, you do it, John.
Thank you. Well, Steve asked me, so I thought I should. Zionism is a political movement that was founded in the very end of the 19th century, which says Jews are having a terrible time in Europe, which was absolutely true. There were pogroms and all kinds of anti-Semitism. And the answer to this is to have a country of our own. So Zionism is about a supposed return to, or at least the availability of, some other country where they could settle. Now, the trouble is most parts of the world have already got populations. So there were discussions about doing it in Africa somewhere and so on. But in the end, the people who were so minded to set up a Jewish state said there's only one place they wanted to do it in, and that was Palestine. So this political Zionism, Zionism as a sort of yearning to return had existed for at least a century. I mean, a lot of it during the Victorian age, but as a political movement aiming at a goal of getting people back on the ground, or on the ground, is started in 1897. And it was a minority taste among the Jewish population in Europe, where there were votes in Poland, which is one of the main sites where Jews lived. There were political movements, and the other main movement, called the Bund, trounced the Zionists regularly in the elections there, because most of the Jews in Poland wanted to stay and make Poland a decent place where they could live, not give up and go somewhere else. So Zionism had this idea of a new state. British interests, which became dominant in the Middle East with the victories in the First World War, thought it would be handy to have a sort of semi-colony in that location and encourage the emigration of Jews there. It varied. Sometimes they blew hot, sometimes they blew cold. But the setting up of the State of Israel, which was the consequence of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, was part of a British imperial strategy. I could go on, but maybe that's enough for now.
Well, that's a background for it. I mean, I think I'll bring you in one sec, Diana, but I think, the other thing that's worth pointing out is that there has been this confusion, conflation, ignorance, whatever else it's been, where opposition to that particular political viewpoint has now become almost synonymous in the kind of daily discourse, certainly in the mainstream media, etc., with anti-Semitism, and that's been, the adoption of the IHRA, etc., has confused that. The person who definition said he was worried that was going to be used as a club to stop people from talking about the conduct of the Israeli government, etc., etc. So, I mean, that's more or less kind of how the Labour Party's ended up where it is in the moment, I think. And there's been that push, I would say, on the part of some, and an acquiescence on the part of others to more or less kind of put those two things together as if they were one. And
yeah.
So Diana, sorry.
Can I add something? One of the interesting things about is some of the first Zionists, before even Jews were Zionists, were English people. I mean, George Eliot was a Zionist, and there was what was his name? Holman Hunt. Yes, Holman Hunt, the painter, was a Zionist. They were sorry for the Jews and decided that it would be a good idea to move them to Palestine. But other than that, a lot of people who were anti-Semites were Zionists. I mean, Balfour himself didn't like the Jews and liked the idea that they should be moved to another country like Israel. So he was open to the idea of having a Balfour Declaration, get rid of the Jews. That would be a good idea. And he was very supportive, but he was also supportive of the Aliens Act in 1907, which deprived Jews of the opportunity to come to this country. And that you will find that Herzl, who was the founder of Zionism, found that the people who were most sympathetic to him were the anti-Semites. He actually wrote this in his book. So it's when they say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, we should also look at the people today who are sympathetic to Zionism and who aren't Jewish. I mean, Christian Zionists and others who a case could be made that they have anti-Semitic ideas. So it's an interesting fallacy that necessarily.
Yes, well, I mean, one of the reasons that Zionism is well supported in the US is that there's so many church people in the US, and the Christian religion in a certain sense is kind of written into their fabric. And but it's not actually, when you get down to it, it's not a pleasant thing, because they have this belief that that before Jesus can come back, then the Jews have to live back in Israel, but they're going to get destroyed, or they're either going to become Christians or get destroyed. Well, in the process of that, so it's kind of it might be expedient at the moment, for those people to see Israel.
Could I bring in?
But it's a strange kind of mix. Go on, Jonathan.
Yeah, there's a sort of logical error, really, which is that you're accused of being anti-Semitic because you say something negative about Israel. All states have negative things to be said about them. Israel is a country; it's not a person. It's not. Since it's not a person, it can't be a Jewish person. In Israel, about a quarter of the population, or a fifth of the population, is non-Jewish, and in fact, Israel controls almost an equal number of non-Jewish citizens. because of its occupied territory. So when you're attacking Israel, you're attacking the way a particular political entity is behaving, both internally and externally. You're not the fact that it may be being controlled, I think, to some extent, illegitimately by a Jewish majority. That's because you exclude all of the Muslims and others in the occupied territories from having a vote. Doesn't make it a Jewish entity. It makes it a state which is proclaiming racial superiority of the Jews over everybody else within its boundaries, and that is subject to criticism. We criticize it for its lack of humanity and its lack of respect for people's rights, not because it's Jewish.
And and we've seen that taken to extremes sometimes. I mean, there was the Labour Friends of Israel group, I think it was back in 2018, when the Israeli military killed a lot of unarmed protesters in the Nakba annual commemoration. And Labour Friends of Israel put out a tweet, which I think they subsequently deleted and apologised for, but saying that they essentially blaming the Palestinians for getting themselves killed.
Yes.
And the Palestinian leaders for putting them in that situation, rather than anybody actually was pulling the trigger at the other end of the gun. So those things have gone to quite shocking extremes sometimes in terms of trying to demonize Palestinians and justify everything that that the government of Israel does. I mean, there's no government in the world that does the right thing all the time. So the criticism of the government is a justified thing. But Diana, let's give people some of the background of this BBC program. Tell us about when did the BBC get in touch with you? How was that all set up, and what then ultimately happened to cause it not to take place?
Well, there was negotiation went on, especially after the Guardian published that piece. And the negotiations, I think, had been ongoing because I think it was a religious program, and unlike most of the Jewish members of left-wing Jews, I happen to be an Orthodox. I attend an Orthodox synagogue. I'm a member of an Orthodox synagogue. I keep a kosher home, which is unusual. And for a religious program, I think the fact that I was slightly unusual as a left Jew, they wanted to find out a little bit more and to explore the religious elements of it. And so they interviewed me, and there was going to be another debate between Robert Cohen, who's a well-known writer who writes excellent for Patreon, I think, and he writes a commentary which I would advise people to read. Excellent commentary, and he was going to speak with the rabbi, and then suddenly, just before, after I'd been interviewed, the interview was in the can, and then I heard through the Jewish news and the the reportedly helping, well known. He does a lot of. He has said some rather nasty things about me, and I read the article, and I read that the Board of Deputies had decided, had made representations, and that was the end of that. It was really rather nasty. It was really rather, it was again the usual malicious smears and attacks that we've come to expect. And that was the end of that, I'm afraid. But I'm not saying we did, there was an effort to put it on, but then I think in the end, they haven't said that they won't ever have a program like this. They have left it up in the air. So I'm hoping that maybe if the My view is that this conversation, this debate must take place. After all, it's not only Jews who have this ideological belief, Palestinians do. Many Muslims in this country have the same ideological belief. They are not Zionists, and certainly no Palestinian. I've never yet met a Palestinian who's a Zionist, and in fact, most of them are anti-Zionists because they see that ideology has been, that political ideology has been responsible for their own dislocation from their state. So, I believe that it's they, by silencing me, they're also silencing Palestinians, they're silencing many Muslims in this country who probably have the same view.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things out of that whole episode really that struck me the most, Dali, was the coverage of the program when it hadn't yet been formally withdrawn. The president, I think, of the Board of Deputies said that everybody has a right to their beliefs and to discuss their beliefs, but it shouldn't be on the BBC. So it was kind of, yes, you can have it as long as you don't tell anybody. It was a strange kind of position that they took, and presumably the BBC in the. I mean, okay, so your belief in anti-Zionism, your lawyers are arguing with the Labour Party is a protected belief. So tell us a little bit about what a protected belief is to begin with, and why anti-Zionism, because this is what the BBC wouldn't have on. Let's talk about that now. How is it a protected belief, and what does that mean?
A protected belief is a genuinely held belief. It's not an opinion or viewpoint based on the present state of information, but it's a belief concerning the fundamental nature of political Zionism as an ideology. And it concerns a weighty and substantial aspect of human life and behavior. And I can go into the fact of what Zionism is. It's an ideology. It founded Israel. It continues to dispossess the Palestinians, to treat them as less than human, as one Palestinian once said, as children of a lesser God. It controls all aspects of their lives. And the belief has to be cogent, cohesive, serious. And it isn't a belief that should affect the dignity or the lives of other people. So we're not talking about a belief like, say, anti-vaxxers or climate denial or anything like that, which cannot really be defended with evidence. It's not based on evidence. It's not cogent. It's it is possibly a conspiracy. I mean, we're not talking about a conspiracy. We're talking about a well-formed belief that you've developed it over a period of time, and you can defend it. And so that is what it is. That is why, and frankly, because I believe there's been this huge effort to say that if you're an anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite. And I think I want to scotch that. And I'm hoping that what I've said does make sense to people, because I've looked it up legally, and I'm actually reading the legal background to it at the moment.
Jonathan, do you want to add anything like that?
No, I think that's fine. I think, I just mentioned that coming to anti-Zionism for somebody who's Jewish is not that easy. I mean, I grew up as a Zionist. My grandfather worked for 30 years full time collecting money for the Jewish National Fund to help establish Israel. My parents were both officers and presidents and so on of various Jewish organizations in Liverpool, I grew up applauding Israel's victories in the various wars that went on in the 50s and 60s. So that was where I came from. And it's only the behavior of Israel that has led me in the end to re-examine the basis of that and think that there is no justification for treating other human beings in the way that Israel has done. And it was that they started with a policy of retaliation against people who tried to re-enter the country, for example. And I kept thinking, now Israel's won the 1967 war, it's got secure frontiers, it's the dominant military power in the area. Now it's going to make peace on good terms with the Arabs. And of course, that didn't happen. And gradually, from the 70s onwards, I began to become more critical. My mother, who had been a lifelong Zionist, ended up saying to me, I didn't think this wasn't the Israel I thought we were trying to create. So, she remained a Zionist, but she was a very disappointed one. I took the further step of realizing that this difficulty was part and parcel of the original proposal to settle a new state with new people in a country which was already occupied. And unfortunately, that didn't happen through a process of agreement and mutual accommodation. It came, in effect, through conquest in the end. And the Israelis have been anxious to maintain the dominance of the Jews in that area. And that's what turned me into an anti-Zionist, not an anti-Semite.
Yes. I forget if it was JLM, Jewish Labour Movement, or Labour Friends of Israel, or one of those groups that put out a briefing note recently for their supporters in the how to respond with the Palestine, something the Palestine Solidarity Campaign was doing. And one of the things in there that I covered on my site was the fact that they said in this written down document, that about Israel occupying the land that the Palestinians abandoned in 1948. And I don't think you call it abandoned if you're forced out at gunpoint and killed if you try to get back in. But this level of kind of Orwellian language almost, that's used to whitewash things, etc., is quite, can be quite scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I too grew. I mean, I don't know. My parents, of course, were not great Zionists, but they were very pro-Israel. But I was quite a fanatical Zionist. I joined a Zionist youth movement, and I was going to go and settle in Israel. But in some ways, it was fortunate that I was born in South Africa, because I already understood what apartheid was. And when I visited as an adolescent with a group, we were going to go eventually and start a kibbutz. I was so shocked by what I found, and it seemed to me so like the South Africa I'd left, that I became very confused, and I found it very difficult, because it's actually very painful to give up an idea that you've attached your whole life to. And it was quite painful for me, and it took me a long time. But unlike a lot of people, it was the 1967 war that finally did it for me, because I saw what they did then, and I couldn't defend it.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's worth bringing up at that point, because you mentioned it before the program, I think, Jonathan, about the late Desmond Tutu, who died recently, and the fact that The Guardian, and I'm not sure about the BBC, but certainly Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, managed to pay tribute to the late and great Desmond Tutu without actually mentioning anything about it, what he said about Israel and Palestine, which he was extremely vocal on, and occasionally got into trouble for. But it just was glaring by its omission, really, from the whole discussion about what he had done in his life.
I got a story there which connects to actually the pressure on the BBC, which the BBC caved into. I think Diana's told me that the people on the program were very keen to go ahead. The decision to pull it was taken at a higher level, and we see sort of the same thing happening over the Tutu obituary in the Guardian. So the Guardian produced a very good, I think it was probably 2-page length obituary of this wonderful man, managing not to mention one of the major campaigns he'd been working on for like 20 years, which was about how what was happening in Israel was a repetition of things that had happened in apartheid, and indeed it was even worse. And he campaigned actively on that, and somehow it wasn't mentioned. Well, a lot of people wrote into the Guardian, but they put comments under the article on the website saying, oh, you missed out that. And 13 of them at least were deleted within minutes of being posted up. So not only was Tutu's excoriation of Israeli apartheid not to be mentioned on the obituary, but nobody else could mention its absence by writing it in the comments. And there's been quite an uproar about that. I've been involved in drafting letters and petitions and things. And one petition has currently got 3,500 signatures, and we've written to Catherine Viner, the editor of the Guardian. We haven't unfortunately had a response, but we still live in hope. But it's not just the BBC, it's not just the Guardian. Either they are cowed by the worry, by accusations like the Board of Deputies did, or they worry in advance and decide not to publish stuff. But it puts a different sense on the phrase free speech. It's free speech so long as you say the things that we are willing to permit. And the media silence on most of these stories is extraordinary.
We don't have the right to, it is an issue of free speech. We should have the right to debate it. But now, if you look at the way the IHRA has pushed everything before it, and now this government wants to make the IHRA compulsory, and I don't know if it will continue. They want to remove money from universities who don't subscribe to the IHRA. And in my view, the IHRA is mere... Its examples are there to defend Israel, not to defend Jews. I can't hear you, Steve. You're not.
Excuse me, Kenneth Stern, who wrote the IHRA definition, said he had grave concerns because it was being used to suppress criticism of Israel. So he knew, he wrote it, and he thought that, and I think was attacked by supporters of Israel for saying so. So that, it's... Sorry, Jonathan, were you going to come in on something there and I got across you?
Well, I was going to mention about Kenneth Stern is the American originator of the definition, and he and a few other people, but he was the main author, designed it as a way of collecting statistics on how much anti-Semitism there was around the world, and he came up with these 11 questions, which the idea was that people in different countries would collect examples of this sort of thing, and not that they were absolute measures of when people were being anti-Semitic, but to get a sense whether it was going up or down. If next year there were more examples of these sorts of remarks than there were last time, that might be an indication of increased anti-Semitism. If one country had more than another, that might suggest one country was more anti-Semitic than the other. But then somebody added on a few 38 words in front of it and claimed it was a definition, and that all these were not things to collect because they might be indicative of anti-Semitism. They were regarded as clear, the way it's been interpreted, as clear cases of anti-Semitism. So anybody who says something which was given as an example in that definition is now assumed to have said something anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Whereas
even the definition itself doesn't say that, does it? Because it says that these examples could be
depending on
context, etc. And the depending on context bit just has been stripped away in the conversation about all this in the media, and just and has been treated as an absolute, really. But I think it's on the one hand we've had the media being very willing to amplify, and they had their own political reasons for doing this, obviously, but very willing to amplify every suggestion of discrimination or anti-Semitism in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour. We're now seeing a complete silence on much clearer issues, let's say, on in Keir Starmer's Labour Party, because the statistics that Jewish Voice for Labour presented to the Equality and Human Rights Commission showed that there was if you were an executive member, a committee member of Jewish Voice for Labour, you were 200 times more likely to be suspended or kicked out of the Labour Party than a non-Jewish member of the party. And if you were just an ordinary member of Jewish Voice for Labour, you were still 30 odd times more likely to be kicked out. So if you are, if you are left-wing and Jewish, you have a real problem in Keir Starmer's Labour Party, more so than any other left-winger, which makes it, to me, a racist thing. And yet, so far as I'm aware, the IHRA hasn't paid any, taken any action on this, and the media certainly hasn't reported on it anything like, to the degree that would be appropriate given the scale of the thing.
If you were a member of, or you knew of a club where Jewish members were much more likely to be thrown out than non-Jewish members, you might say that organization was being anti-Semitic. What's curious is that they're using anti-Semitism as a redefined anti-Semitism as a sort of excuse for kicking Jews out. It's extraordinary.
Yes, and I mean, and it has to be said, it's not only anti-Semitism that's being used. The Labour Party is, has been accused, and in my opinion, is grossly Islamophobic at the moment, and has targeted Muslims. It's in the process of targeting Muslims now at local authority level in various parts of the country, just kicking, deselecting every Muslim, and particularly every Kashmiri, from local authorities, even if they sat on there for decades on the basis that they're not experienced enough and whatever. And
but that's the opposite way around, because they're kicking people out, alleging anti-Semitism, while people inside are practicing Islamophobia and not being kicked out.
Yes, and that gets nothing from the very little mention at all from the media, which is a shameful thing in my opinion. But then there's been vile discrimination against gypsies and other ethnic groups that have again still had very little attention from the media compared to the absolute feeding frenzy that went on in the Jeremy Corbyn era.
It was extraordinary what they did and how silent they are. It does tell you something about the nature of the media and the nature of what we call free speech, because it's not what they publish, it's what they are silent about and what they allow to be silenced. And this is a terrible thing, because if voices are silent, then ideas don't get the currency they deserve.
Yeah, it's worth saying. Sorry, Diana. It's worth saying that it's very interesting. I'd just give a case. Very occasionally, very rarely, does somebody from Jewish Voice for Labour get interviewed by the BBC. We've seen that in Diana's case, it doesn't seem to be happening. There was a case about a year ago where the chair of Jewish Voice for Labour, Jenny Manson, was interviewed on Newsnight by Kirsty Walk, in fact. I can't remember what issue there was at the moment. It was obviously about anti-Semitism, which is why they were there. And Kirsty Walk gave a entirely proper but tough set of questions to Jenny. And then she was going to turn to interview Louise Ellman, Dame Louise Ellman, who was, I think, still then at that stage a Labour MP. As she turned, and she gave Louise Ellman an extraordinary series of pat ball questions, serving up a ball for her to do, the easy questions. But as she turned to start that series, she said to Louise Ellman, "Oh God, we've heard from people like Jenny Manson and her ilk." That was the phrase, Jenny Manson and her ilk. Now, there was a sort of, that I don't think it was deliberate. I think it was, there is an assumption on the BBC that people who go against the official story that Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic. All left people like Diana and I, even if we're Jewish, if we're on the left, we're anti-Semitic. That is so strongly ingrained now in the views of those who run these programs. They don't even know it's an assumption that they're making.
There is a slight difference between the two. So if you hear focus bracketing, it's more geared towards that feature on this camera that I'm going to show you how to set up.
Just burst into life on its own there. It's been a bit strange today. Yes, yeah, I did an article again on the fact that, you know, I think Jenny got suspended because of comments on that program, which he was responding to perfectly factually from the interviewer. Yes. And you know, the Labour right, the current regime has no shame. I suspect we might finish a few minutes early tonight, but before you go, Diana, because I think you've got to get off as well. What I did want to get into that we haven't touched on yet really is the personal impact on you of all this. Because you know, I mean, you're a Jewish grandma. You've got you've got your family seeing all this. You've got your own feelings. They must have been massively impacted and hurt as well by this, you know, kind of war really that's been conducted against you and other JVL members by the Labour right.
I can't tell you how painful it is. If you are a Jew, if you know what it is to experience anti-Semitism, and I don't know if you know, but my son was beaten up by a man called Tony Lacombe, who was a luminary in the BNP. He was beaten up. Tony Lacombe went to jail for 3 years for that. We had phone calls saying, "Die, you Jewish bitch." That was what we were getting. I answered the phone, and we had a swastika on our gate. Now this is anti-Semitism. This is fearful. This is a struggle. And then to be told that because I have an opinion that they disagree with, that I am an anti-Semite, you've got no idea. I lost my husband. I was very frightened. I was very alone. I had no one to share this with. And having experienced anti-Semitism myself, and knowing, because I grew up during the war and after the war, I know what anti-Semitism is. I know what it can do and where it comes from and where it goes. And I've fought it all my life. I haven't seen half these people who are attacking me fighting anti-Semitism. They haven't been on the marches that I've been on anti-racist marches and against anti-Semitism. I mean, I've got a long history. There are many people who could tell you about that. And then to come and tell me, I'm sorry, I get very upset by it. I was very distressed and pained. And they have no right to do it. Who do they think they are? So but that's why I feel I've got to take a stand. That's why I must take a stand. Because if I don't, if they come for me, as I said, they can come for anybody. And that is why when people if you don't stand up, as I once said, well, it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees, something Socialist said, and that's the way I feel. I've got to do it. I've got to do it because I've stood up against racism all my life, and I'm not going to stop now at the end of my life.
Jonathan, anything you want to say on that? I'll round up
with that really strong statement from Diana.
Just one last thing then. Do I understand correctly? I mean, at the time that I covered this on Squawk Box, there'd been no response from the party. The party hadn't bothered even answering yet to your letters. Have they come back with anything yet after weeks?
That's so typical.
So
So typical.
it's that
And then
arrogance,
they
isn't
will
it?
say, but have you heard what Starmer has said? He will so often say, "Oh, now we've dealt with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party." He said, "Now I mean, I'm going to tell you a story I heard today. I heard from a friend, I won't mention who, that he's got a friend in Norwich who's a member of the Labour Party who was active in I think somewhere she had a role in the Labour Party, which she resigned. And someone on the right of the party came and said, well, at least the party is a safe place for Jews. And then she showed them the article from The Guardian about me, and he was shocked. And this was someone on the right of the Labour Party. So really, a lot of people don't know what's going on because the press isn't publishing it.
That's the big issue. Folks, I really do appreciate you coming on the program and enlightening us about this. It's been very interesting. I'm sure people watching have found it interesting as well. Diana, I think we were told we could only have you for half an hour, and we kept you for 45 minutes. So, I do thank you for bearing with us. I am going to just round off on one thing on a different topic, because we did have, we do want to get a message of solidarity out to the people at the Safe Education for All group, because they've been absolutely hounded in the press today again, with the media giving doing its job of supporting the establishment, because they've been critical, I think, of the government this morning on the Good Morning Britain programme. So just a message out of solidarity to those folks to say, you're trying to keep your kids safe, and if anybody doesn't get that and thinks that's a cause to attack you, then they need a solid look at themselves and their own what passes for their own humanity. So thank you ever so much again for that. If you've watched this live, then thank you for that. If you're watching catch up, again, thank you. Do share this, and do the subscribe bit on your social media, so that you can keep up with the rest of what I think will be a busy year for Socialist Telly in 2022. Folks, thank you ever so much, and good night.
Thank you for having